Okay. Now I'll start the read. Franz Liszt died on the 31st of July in 1886. He could not recall the finer details. Now, however, he found himself in full possession of his senses and mental faculties, walking purposefully along a street, his destination revealed by an invitation held in his pocket, an invitation with a succinct message: Mrs. Magda G. requests your attendance at the Reich Chancellery bunker on May 1st, 1945. In the Reich Chancellery, apparently these facilities were located beneath the ground, he found himself sitting on a chair, not knowing how he had got there so quickly and without further ado. He examined the room, which was shaken back and forth by detonations at irregular intervals. He saw a long oak table, around it chairs with high padded backrests, then a bust of a male head that was the exact same shade as the plaster trickling out of the gaps in the walls. This head exerted an irresistible draw upon him. Then, though, he saw a pianoforte in a remote corner. Diagonally opposite him, its black varnish densely strewn with dusty mortar and lumps of brickwork. On a stool behind it, in an entirely fearful poise, collapsed into herself, but her gaze still fixed upon the new arrival with questioning, almost imploring attention, sat a middle-aged woman. She had fixed her blonde hair in a bun at the back of her neck and held her chins slightly too raised, red blotches showing here and there on her face. "I'm glad you came, sir," she said, barely audible. "Countess Dagoul was the mother of your children. Is that not correct?" Liszt was confused, so unexpectedly and directly reminded of earlier circumstances by a woman he did not know, but whom he had to assume was suffering. Then, after moments of indecisiveness that formed a notable contrast to the dignity of his age, he stood and approached the pianoforte. "Why are you crying, madame?" he asked. "For heaven's sake, why are you crying?" And as he reached out his arms and was almost tempted to take her hands, since she was now sobbing, he interrupted his labored but friendly gesture, for he noticed in the doorway, which had opened and closed again with unpleasant metallic clang, a delicate-looking man who nodded at the two of them with a blithe smile. "Talk to him," the woman implored, gripping Liszt's right hand. "He wants me to kill my children." At the same time, though, she was clearly ashamed of exposing her husband, who was standing in the doorway and making an effort to appear composed, and exposing him to a stranger, even if that stranger was Franz Liszt. "I'm not claiming," she added, and her face was wet with tears, "I'm not claiming that this were not my wish as well. But you must understand, this wish is something I cannot possibly carry out." "There's no time, the doctor's waiting," said Joseph G., and smiled again. "I'm certain the immortal Franz Liszt will give you the strength to do the unavoidable." At that, he walked towards his wife, gently grasped her by the elbow, and led her, barely resisting, to the door. And Liszt noticed that a deformity and overly short leg impeded his walking. "You want to kill your children?" he asked. And both husband and wife turned around and saw the shocked benevolence in the face of this honorable man, and that he was dressed as a priest. There followed a detonation so powerful that there was reason to fear it would reverberate to the earth's innermost core. The light extinguished, and when the bulb hung from the room's ceiling lit up again, Liszt was alone. He did not know whether he ought to follow the couple, who had obviously disappeared behind the door, and he attempted to comprehend the circumstances in which he found himself. But how can this be, he thought. It is impossible that I have been asked to this house to be made a witness to a crime. I must have misheard. And the reserve he had cultivated throughout his lifetime, the lack of obligation in observing the world as it presented itself on concert tours, the impossibility of seeing through his host's customs or even perceiving them as a much sought-after virtuoso, all this hindered him from taking action this time as well. He decided to wait and see how things developed. He sat down at the pianoforte, having cleared the keyboard and paying no heed to the mortar, and played the first bars of the Waldstein Sonata, up to the trill that attempts to turn the dark, melancholy prelude towards jollity. He did so again, and once more, as though hesitating to disclose the precious delight his hands had so often created. But he played on, and as soon as he began to forget himself, what finally prevailed was his magic, that complete lack of distinction between artist and instrument, which only a virtuoso can create. Once again, the iron door opened, more gently than the first time, and Mrs. G returned to the room. Liszt thought he made out children's voices beyond the corridor, hidden by the door, laughing in play, but the sound was vague and indeterminate, and so distant that he was unsure his senses had not deceived him. "How wonderfully you play, sir," said Mrs. G, and took a seat at the oak table. "I thank you, madame," the pianist replied, interrupting his playing to bow in her direction. The ensuing silence lasted rather too long. Mrs. G looked at the ground and said quietly, as if to herself, and to excuse the lack of communication, "Please don't think badly of my husband. He loves the children just as much as I do, but he too would like to spare them this life." "Madam, what are you talking about?" said Liszt, looking at the woman who seemed lonely to the point of exhaustion, a woman who could be called neither old nor young, neither beautiful nor ugly, neither attractive nor repellent, but touching in her ultimate sadness, and who now returned his gaze. Her head was held high, her hands pressed together to find purchase, but it was her eyes, those widened eyes, apparently helpless in their extreme agitation, that betrayed her as someone making great efforts, despite knowing they had long since left every cause to do so behind. "I'd like to ask you to take care of my children," she said. "I'm worried about what will become of them once they've died. They're still so young, I know," she added. "How kind a man you are, and I very much hope you won't leave my children uncared for." Liszt stared at her hair and noticed that a strand previously fastened with a clip had come loose and now fell over her temple, and that she let this negligence go unheeded. He could not refrain from admiring the grace that had come about for an instant despite all desperation. "But your children are alive," he said, "and they have a mother who cannot possibly wish that were not so." She gave no answer. He was about to ask her for an explanation of her seemingly incomprehensible words. But now Joseph G. appeared in the doorway, apparently intending not to let his wife out of his sight, as he mistrusted her state of mind. When a man can no longer save his house, it becomes his funeral pyre. When a man sacrifices himself and his children, he ennobles their demise, he said. As he spoke, he went to the oak table and sat down, edging so close to his wife that their shoulders touched. How long they sat that way, Liszt could not say. His gaze remained fixed upon the strange couple as he listened to the detonations coming closer and closer. And he saw Joseph G., a man who was long accustomed to such circumstance and tended to react to all external threats with disdain, flinch in response, but it was a reflex to which he paid no regard. Only once, after the door jerked open, as though torn from its hinges, although no one had as much as touched it, did he assure them that the artillery blasts could not possibly endanger these rooms, as they were several meters below ground, and that the German soldiery, though exhausted, though bleeding from countless wounds, was by all means still willing and able to hold the enemy until the evening. Orderlies came bringing news contradicting that confidence. Nobody, they stated, was in a position to defend these embattled streets, that narrow territory between Tiergarten and Vossstrasse. That was all that remained to the powerful men of the Third Reich, not for longer than 1 or 2 hours. So shall it be, said Joseph G. We shook the world because it was about to suffocate in its languor, shook it with iron fists, and we did not embark upon this battle in order to be victorious. For what is victory? It is a cheap win if one does not aim to challenge the entirety of fate, bring destiny to its knees. And once again, Liszt had the sense that he heard children's voices more clearly than the first time, even thinking he could make out the difference in their ages. He rose to his feet. These insane people, he thought, they are waging a war. They wish for their own demise. But I must prevent them from making their children atone for their sins. He thanked his hosts for the invitation, regretted that he could not do anything at all about their desolate situation, but told them he was nonetheless willing to play the pianoforte, should they wish so, and that he would not mind the children. Indeed, he would be delighted by their presence, for, he assured them several times with increasing urgency, he knew no greater pleasure than performing for children. Yes, play, do play, Magda G claimed. But as soon as Joseph G had taken her hand, holding it in a gentle but unequivocally firm grip and smiling, it seemed to Liszt as though she too were triumphant for a moment, her eyes fixed upon the man as upon a magician, one capable of making their own and their children's demise amidst a burning fortress appear a victory. This troubled Liszt. But, he said, I'm sure you won't be so impolite as to leave the room while I'm playing the pianoforte. In my lifetime, I would never have experienced such a thing. To himself, he thought, if this war is to end in a few hours' time, the music must entrance them. Beethoven. Beethoven will save the children's lives. He is more powerful than anything else. The person who can resist the Waldstein Sonata is yet to be born. He began to play. Before he did so, however, he scrutinized his listeners once more, as was his wont, his hands resting on the keyboard. It was a moment of extreme concentration. And as he hit the first chords, he saw Magda G shift away from her husband, almost imperceptibly, by removing a handkerchief from the belt of her dress and raising it to her lips with the slightest possible motion. And Joseph G took no notice of her movement. He, though, Franz Liszt, did indeed see it, and took it as proof of how quickly the magic of his virtuosity began to take effect. It encouraged him. Keep going, keep playing, he thought. I can get through the sonata in 23 minutes, if necessary. But they'll be amazed when this brief eternity lasts until the evening. He repeated the opening, making the chords particularly gentle in an attempt to assuage the couple's dark determination. Then he interrupted his playing before he began the variations, but did not look up so as not to encourage applause. Minutes later, he felt his plan was coming to fruition. Joseph G sat there like someone for whom the state of the world, which was, after all, only his own state, had been miraculously repaired by the music. He looked only at Liszt, at his hands, not seeing how Magda G was trying to master her emotions somewhat by constantly occupying herself with her handkerchief. She was suffering at the thought that the children might approach the room, despite being prohibited from doing so, and drawn by the music. Oh, such wonderful music. Seek their parents' proximity. That proximity in which they could always feel safe, and which they had never been denied. She could not bear the thought that, before the evening set in, she would have to abuse this closeness to deceive her children. Yet for her, too, the interplay of chords, the back and forth of contradictory and then conciliatory tones that expanded the space between her beyond all limits, made that pain desirable. For her, too, the music so curiously made the certainty of death, which was to be brought about so hastily and without dignity, an object of longing. Liszt could not lift their mood, yet his art solidified their desire for their unhappy state to remain unchanged. Indeed, they veritably wished to remain in their desolation for all eternity, a desperation that now seemed just as indispensable to them as the pianoforte. How wonderfully you play, sir, exclaimed Magda G. I thank you, Liszt responded, not bowing to her, but continuing his playing, now firmly convinced the children must be able to hear him, although they were kept so thoroughly hidden. Once again, the iron door opened and the middle-aged man entered the room. He wore a black uniform, the sleeves of his jacket rolled up his elbows, the collar gaping, his cropped hair unkempt, a small suitcase in his left hand. He appeared not to notice the piano playing, his attention still focused on the corridor from whence he had come, and responded to a voice as though he wanted to make sure of some matter. Then he glared at Joseph G. with extreme impatience. It was the doctor, and Liszt felt that this was someone whom he had cause to fear. The same head as I see on the bust over there, he thought, is as pale as marble, without kindness, utterly unreachable. He does not hear music. He saw that the uniform's collar was decorated with a skull, and he could not refrain from admiring the lack of distinction between the face, the uniform, and the insignia of death. Having been fascinated for so many years by the beauty of benevolence, he now faced the beauty of evil and felt how his hands playing, previously a matter of no effort, almost automatic, faltered. How he resisted by pitting the bass notes and the extreme heights against one another, across the octaves, again and again. The doctor remained unmoved, however, and Joseph G. stood slowly and walked to the door, carefully placing his feet on the hard concrete, still looking back at Liszt and the pianoforte. And then, having reached the door, he raised his right arm as if in greeting, with an expression of regret. "I am still playing," the pianist exclaimed. "Good manners detect that the artist must be the first to leave the room." "Madame," he turned now to Magda G., "is there any reason to disrespect my playing in such a manner?" But she was looking at the door too, watching Joseph G. and the doctor withdraw. And as she attempted to stand likewise, she now dropped the handkerchief she had clung to for so long. She wanted to go after the two men, but her knees could not bear the fast movement they were to perform. And so she fell back onto the chair mere moments after rising, hitting her elbow hard against the table. "Help me, sir. He's going to the children. Quickly, give me your arm." "No," answered Liszt, and went on playing on and on. "No," he answered, and he tried to lend strictness to his voice. "As long as you are listening to me, nothing can happen to the children." "You're wrong, sir. If I don't take pity on them, the doctor will kill them. We are guilty. We must not fall into our enemy's hands," she said, immediately shocked at her admission and trying to take it back. "No," she added, and rose from her seat. "No," she repeated, almost imploringly, as she approached Liszt. "We are not guilty." She came so close to him that he felt compelled to interrupt his playing. And when she asked him, this time most forcefully, whether he too believed that they were not guilty, he said, "Madame, I do not know, but as you say it is so, I am inclined to believe you." "I thank you," she answered, and then fell silent. Liszt felt the lamp above their heads, the furniture around them, indeed the entire room begin to vibrate, and he was surprised that it happened in absolute silence. And as Magda G. also remained silent, simply standing in remarkable indecisiveness, and he did not know how to interpret her behavior or whether it would be appropriate to return to playing the pianoforte, he began to speak quietly and urgently. "Madame," he said, "you should not be unjust towards life, and above all, one must not always want something at any price. I had 2 children from my first marriage, Cosima and Blandine. That is, they were in fact born out of wedlock, but I took care of them nonetheless. Blandine died very young, sadly, but Cosima, as you know, was the wife of von Bülow and then Richard Wagner, and did not pass away until 1930. What a long and eventful life. Of course, I too had reasons for dissatisfaction, and I never approved of Cosima's infidelity to von Bülow and her fondness for Wagner. Yet, nor can I claim that my worries over Cosima were considerable. You, Madame, are desperate, but no desperation, not even such that longs for death, must seduce us into seeing everything solely through our own eyes. Nothing exceeds one's own misfortune, And yet, madame, one must let the world, and that includes one's own children, take its course. She listened to him, only now noticing how old the man was. Indeed, that he was on the brink of decrepitude, and his measured, almost leisurely way of speaking did her good. And now it made perfect sense to her that he was wearing a priest's gown. Whether she agreed with his words, he could not say. She seemed to be far, far away in her thoughts. And even when a girl's voice called tentatively for her mother, she seemed not to notice. "How many children do you have?" asked Liszt. She could not answer. She was ashamed. It appeared impossible for her to explain that she had 7 children, but only one of them was safe from her care. It seemed inconceivable to her, too, that one might kill 6 children of such different ages and in such a short time. The smallest ones, yes. What would be so appalling if one were to let them fall asleep close to her, as they were accustomed this time forever? But the older ones, who had some understanding of things, full of mistrust, who had only after ever renewed assurances that nothing could happen to them, bravely held out in their nursery for days. How was one to visit such an extreme act upon them, after having promised to protect them? She was surprised that these thoughts, which she found unbearable, did not almost crush her and force her to lie down, as so often, so as at least to settle her heart to some extent. Everything in her grew light. The ground beneath her feet moved like a shadow, and all at once she remembered much earlier circumstances in which she might have almost fainted with happiness and joy, and she had to swiftly grip the pianoforte, but without Liszt noticing so as not to fall. And because she smiled as she did so, yet could not permit herself to, and feared she was losing control of her senses, she said, "I thank you. I must go to my children. You can hear them yourself. They're calling for me." Liszt wanted to help her. He had noticed full well that she was swaying and struggling to let go of the pianoforte. But as he took the 2 or 3 steps required to reach her, his shoes caught in the hem of his soutane, and he was barely able to prevent himself from tripping. And when, after this clumsiness, he at last tried to offer his arm with a word of apology, she was gone. He stared at the corridor, the iron door wide open like a precipice at the end of the world, and now he realized he had neglected to play. "Wait," he wanted to call. "Please, excuse my negligence. Leave the children in peace. I haven't finished playing. We haven't reached the end of the sonata." But he sensed how pointless it all was, merely murmured a few hasty words, and stood there like a man forced to watch as the very disaster he had meant to avoid unfolded because of him and, as he believed, because of his babbling. He felt his back grow cold, and his hands, those precious hands schooled for extreme discipline, begin to tremble. And he was unable to obey the panicked desire to return to the pianoforte immediately, irrevocably, so as to rectify his failure. But then he did reach the keyboard, though with the impression that he had forced his arms and legs into the act and began to play. "Thank heaven," he thought. "This instrument makes everything vibrate, if only one works magic upon it." And it really was so. The guilty conscience that drove him on, the desperate hope that he might drive everything underneath the earth closer to him again, if only he were heard everywhere. But also the thought that if he did not play, The children might scream with horror in their despair, and he would be condemned to hear them. All this made him start the adagio with such agitation and surging energy that it seemed as though the all too cramped room, the iron door, and even the corridor were being blown apart through the force of a trombone. But he did not leave it at that. "Don't you dare," he called out. "Don't you dare harm those children. They are God's creatures. And I don't presume to judge the world. I am just as base as you are. But anyone who murders their children shall neither live nor die in all eternity, shall be called neither father nor mother." And the more he raised his voice, the less reserved his threats grew. The more urgently he wished to prevent the children's misfortune at any price, the more clearly he felt that his strength was no longer sufficient for such great rage. And for a while he seemed to hold out, until a cough he was unable to suppress robbed him of breath, and he had to turn away from the pianoforte, keeping the sonata going with his right hand, as the left now lay motionless on the keyboard. He wheezed and struggled for air, unable to rid himself of the weakness that had come over him. He hoped someone would appear, or, if that were too much to ask, at least a voice would ring out, not necessarily even addressing him. But all remained silent. He folded the music stand back, closed the pianoforte. Well, he thought, fine. Then I have done what I could, and now all heavens are closed. He sat there, collapsed, his head bowed, his hands resting on his knees, and his breathing gradually slowed. He was overcome by a feeling of indifference. He thought of the Countess d'Agoult and remembered he had not attended her burial. That was what he thought of now. And also that he had asked too much of the Waldstein Sonata, asked the impossible. Above the earth, 7 or 8 meters closer to heaven, the spring began. The horse chestnuts blossomed. They struggled to assert themselves over the scent hanging over the burning cities. End of story. So take a deep breath and just capture this for a minute. Okay. And now we can discuss comments or questions.
So what happened with the kids?
They were murdered that night. Magda G and Joseph G are actually, they imply that the Lange, the author, meant the Goebbels. Their names were Magda Goebbels and Joseph Goebbels, and they had 6 surviving children, and they did kill them in order, they said, to protect them from the world, and before they committed suicide themselves, because they knew they were guilty, even though they said they weren't, but they knew the world would come after them.
You know, I listened to the whole story, and being a musician myself, I naively thought that it was going to have, let's say, between quotation marks, a happy ending. I thought, because I'm convinced that music can change people and people's moods, I was convinced that Beethoven, Liszt, and the music were going to make the miracle. So it has been very, very terrible for me in particular at the end of this story.
Yeah.
So Marjorie, this is Mark Raymond. I have a little bit of a question for you. The author is still alive at age 83. He is quite well respected. He's written a lot of literature, and Unfortunately, we don't know him in this country. His Wikipedia is in German. There's nothing in English, so you can see that we don't. But he was born in 1937. So my question is, during the Nazi era, he was a child. He didn't know too much, I don't think, during his childhood years was able to comprehend. So in 1942, he was 5 years old. So, and he wrote this piece, I think he was around 47 or 48. Do you have any story about Hartmut and being German and writing about a period of such terrible things that he did live through? Did you find anything about how that affected his writing?
Yeah, he was born in 37, and this happened in 45, so he was 8 years old. And so he would have a memory of the war for sure. And I think for me, I don't know this from reading anything but about him, but for me, this was the killing of their children was the epitome of the unthinkably horrible, amoral, it just, you can't imagine anything worse. And so he went to the epitome of beauty and music to try to counteract it. And that's why how this story wound up. Hartmut Lange is also, yes, you're right. He wrote lots of plays, poems, books, all kinds of things. But he is best known for being the grand master of the short story. And I think you can tell from this, I mean, he's a brilliant short story teller. I mean, putting Liszt, as if he was coming to life again through this mission to try to stop the murders. But I don't know enough about him. I have to look up more and see.
Well, it was quite a choice. I mean, it was just fascinating.
It's. I mean, I hope people found it riveting. To me, it brings up a lot of issues. Ethics, art. Man's inhumanity to man. At what point do we become so cold to humanity? I mean, and how can we prevent that?
And motherhood and fatherhood and the different tactics people took in the story, the father versus the mother.
Yeah. And how their intense love for the kids turned into this horrible act. I mean, it's love. Any intense passion has its opposite in an intense passion, I guess. And,
Well, the one thing that I thought about is, did he need to kill the children? Would they have suffered if they had lived?
Well, that's what Liszt was thinking and what Lange was thinking in writing this up on, from Liszt's perspective. Yeah, why? And that, Liszt said, look, even though I had an illegitimate child, look who she became and the life that she led. I mean, this could happen with your 6 children too. Let them be their own agents,
I think one thing I found interesting from looking at his life was that he worked at the Babelsberg Film Academy, which is where all Goebbels films were shot. And then after that, he obviously didn't work for Goebbels. So after that, in 1960, he left East Germany and went to Yugoslavia, and then from Yugoslavia was able to re-enter West Germany and then stayed on in West Germany and then with unification. So I think he as a child, went through the war, and then he worked at a place where all the propaganda films were made, and he then lived under communist oppression. And so I think his early life was very imbued with the fact that no, music didn't conquer. Many of the Nazi rulers loved music and played fabulous music all the time, and yet went on and did horrible things. So it never did. So that, I think, was a question he posed here: can music conquer all and conquer evil? And the answer, I guess, is no, in his mind.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, it probably can for some people, but for those who have already committed to a stone cold inhumanity, that's decided to commit such, who purposely wanted to commit such treacherous acts, that it's immobile. You can't shake it, even with this something so beautiful. If there are no. Are there other comments or questions? Because what I would like to do is to have the antithesis to the heaviness of this short story with a short 10-15 minutes, an Oscar Wilde one that is literally the antithesis, the antithesis of the Waldstein Sonata story. So this is called the Model Millionaire. Okay. Unless one is wealthy, there is no use in being a charming fellow. Romance is the privilege of the rich, not the profession of the unemployed. The poor should be practical and prosaic.
Candles for,
it is better. It is better to have a permanent income than to be fascinating. These are the great truths of modern life, which Huey Erskine never realized. Poor Huey. Intellectually, we must admit, he was not of much importance. He never said a brilliant or even an ill-natured thing in his life. But then he was wonderfully good-looking, with his crisp brown hair, his clear-cut profile, and his gray eyes. He was as popular with men as he was with women, and he had every accomplishment except that of making money. His father had bequeathed him his cavalry sword and a history of the Peninsular War in 15 volumes. Huey hung the first over his looking glass, put the second on a shelf between Ruff's Guide and Bailey's Magazine, and lived on $200 a year that an old aunt allowed him. He had tried everything. He had gone on the stock exchange for 6 months. But what was a butterfly to do among bulls and bears? He had been a tea merchant for a little longer, but that soon tired of Picot and Souchong. And then he had tried selling dry sherry. That did not answer. The sherry was a little too dry. Ultimately, he became nothing. A delightful, ineffectual young man with a perfect profile and no profession. To make matters worse, he was in love. The girl he loved was Loa Merton, the daughter of a retired colonel who had lost his temper and his digestion in India and had never found either of them again. Laura adored him, and he was ready to kiss her shoestrings. They were the handsomest couple in London and had not a penny pieced between them. The colonel was very fond of Huey, but would not hear of any engagement. "Come to me, my boy, when you have got 10,000 pounds of your own, and we'll see about it," he used to say. And Huey looked very glum in those days and had to go to Laura for consolation. One morning, as he was on his way to Holland Park, where the Mertons lived, he dropped in to see a great friend of his, Alan Trevor. Trevor was a painter. Indeed, few people escape that nowadays. But he was also an artist, and artists are rather rare. Personally, he was a strange, rough fellow with a freckled face and red, ragged beard. However, when he took up the brush, he was a real master, and his pictures were eagerly sought after. He had been very much attracted by Huey at first, it must be acknowledged, entirely on account of his personal charm. The only people a painter should know, he used to say, are people who are bête and beautiful, people who are an artistic pleasure to look at and an intellectual repose to talk to. Men who are dandies and women who are darlings rule the world. At least they should do so. However, after he got to know Huey better, he liked him quite as much for his bright, buoyant spirits and his generous, reckless nature, and had given him the permanent entree to his studio. When Huey came in, he found Trevor putting the finishing touches to a wonderful life-size picture of a beggar man. The beggar himself was standing on a raised platform in a corner of the studio. He was a wizened old man with a face like wrinkled parchment and a most piteous expression. Over his shoulders was flung a coarse brown cloak, all tears and tatters. His thick boots were patched and cobbled, and with one hand he leaned on a rough stick, while with the other he held out his battered hat for alms. "What an amazing model," whispered Huey as he shook his hands with his friend. "An amazing model?" shouted Trevor at the top of his voice. "I should think so. Such beggars as he are not to be met with every day. A trouvaille, mon cher. A living Velasquez. My stars, what an etching Rembrandt would have made of him." "Poor old chap," said Huey. "How miserable he looks. But I suppose to you painters, his face is his fortune?" "Certainly," replied Trevor. "You don't want a beggar to look happy, do you?" "How much does a model get for sitting?" asked Huey, as he found himself a comfortable seat on a divan. "A shilling an hour." "And how much do you get for your picture, Alan?" "Oh, for this I get 2,000 pounds. Guineas. Painters, poets, and physicians always get guineas." "Well, I think the model should have a percentage," cried Huey, laughing. "They work quite as hard as you do." "Nonsense, nonsense. Why, look at the trouble of laying on the paint alone and standing all day long at one's easel. It's all very well, Huey, for you to talk, but I assure you that there are moments when art almost attains to the dignity of manual labor. But you mustn't chatter. I'm very busy. Smoke a cigarette and keep quiet." After some time, the servant came in and told Trevor that the frame maker wanted to speak to him. "Don't run away, Huey," he said as he went out. "I'll be back in a moment." The old beggar man took advantage of Trevor's absence to rest for a moment on a wooden bench that was behind him. He looked so forlorn and wretched that Huey could not help pitying him, and felt in his pockets to see what money he had. All he could find was a sovereign and some coppers. "Poor old fellow," he thought to himself, "he wants it more than I do. But it means no hansoms for a fortnight." And he walked across the studio and slipped the sovereign into the beggar's hand. The old man started, and a faint smile flitted across his withered lips. "Thank you, sir," he said. "Thank you." Then Trevor arrived, and Huey took his leave, blushing a little at what he had done. He spent the day with Laura, got a charming scolding for his extravagance, and had to walk home. Then Trevor arrived, and Huey took his leave, blushing a little at what he had done. That night he strolled into the Palette Club about 11 o'clock and found Trevor sitting by himself in the smoking room drinking hock and seltzer. Well, Alan, did you get the picture finished all right? He said as he lit his cigarette. Finished and framed, my boy, answered Trevor. And, by the by, you have made a conquest. That old model you saw is quite devoted to you. I had to tell him all about you, who you are, where you live, what your income is, what prospects you have. My dear Alan, cried Hughie, I shall probably find him waiting for me when I go home. But of course, you are only joking. Poor old wretch. I wish I could do something for him. I think it is dreadful that anyone should be so miserable. I have got heaps of old clothes at home. Do you think he would care for any of them? Why, his rags were falling to bits. But he looks splendid in them, said Trevor. I wouldn't paint him in a frock coat for anything. What do you call rags? I call romance. What seems poverty to you is picturesqueness to me. However, I'll tell him of your offer. Alan, said Hughie seriously, you painters are a heartless lot. An artist's heart is his head, replied Trevor. And besides, our business is to realize the world as we see it, not to reform it as we know it. À chacun son métier. And now tell me how Laura is. The old model was quite interested in her. You don't mean to say you talked to him about her, said Louis. Certainly I did. He knows all about the relentless colonel, the lovely Laura, and the 10,000 pounds. You told that old beggar all my private affairs? Cried Hughie, looking very red and angry. My dear boy, said Trevor, smiling, that old beggar, as you call him, is one of the richest men in Europe. He could buy all London tomorrow without overdrawing his account. He has a house in every capital, dines off gold plate, and can prevent Russia going to war when he chooses. What on earth do you mean? Exclaimed Hughie. What I say, said Trevor. The old man you saw today in the studio was Baron Hausberg. He is a great friend of mine, buys all my pictures and that sort of thing, and gave me a commission a month ago to paint him as a beggar. Et voulez-vous? La fantaisie d'un millionnaire. And I must say, he made a magnificent figure in his rags, or perhaps I should say my rags. They are an old suit I got in Spain. Baron Hausberg, cried Hughie. Good heavens. I gave him a sovereign? And he sank into an armchair, the picture of dismay. Gave him a sovereign, shouted Trevor, and he burst into a roar of laughter. My dear boy, you'll never see it again. Son affaire, c'est l'argent des autres. His affairs are other people's money. I think you might have told me, Alan, said Hughie sulkily, and not have let me make such a fool of myself. Well, to begin with, Hughie, said Trevor, it never entered my mind that you went about distributing alms in that reckless way. I can understand your kissing a pretty model, but you're giving a sovereign to an ugly one? By Jove, no. Besides, the fact is that I really was not at home today to anyone, and when you came in, I didn't know whether Hausberg would like his name mentioned. You know, he wasn't in full dress. What a duffer he must think me, said Hughie. Not at all. He was in the highest spirits after you left, kept chuckling to himself and rubbing his old wrinkled hands together. I couldn't make out why he was so interested to know all about you, but I see it all now. He'll invest your sovereign for you, Hughie, pay you interest every 6 months, and have a capital story to tell after dinner. I am an unlucky devil, growled Hughie. The best thing I can do now is go to bed, and my dear Alan, you mustn't tell anyone. I shouldn't dare show my face in the Row. Nonsense. It reflects the highest credit on your philanthropic spirit, Hughie. And don't run away. Have another cigarette and you can talk about Laura as much as you like. However, Hughie wouldn't stop, but walked home, feeling very unhappy, and leaving Alan Trevor in fits of laughter. The next morning, as he was at breakfast, the servant brought him up a card on which was written, Monsieur Gustave Naudin, de la part de Monsieur le Baron Hausberg. I suppose he has come for an apology, said Hughie to himself, and he told the servant to show the visitor up. An old gentleman with gold spectacles and gray hair came into the room and said in a slight French accent, Have I the honor of addressing Monsieur Erskine? Hughie bowed. I have come from Baron Hausberg, he continued. The Baron, I beg, sir, that you will offer him my sincerest apologies, stammered Hughie. The Baron, said the old gentleman with a smile, has commissioned me to bring this letter to you, and he extended a sealed envelope. On the outside was written, a wedding present to Hugh Erskine and Laura Merton from an old beggar. And inside was a check for £10,000. When they were married, Alan Trevor was the best man, and the Baron made a speech at the wedding breakfast. Millionaire models, remarked Alan, are rare enough, but, by Jove, model millionaires are rarer still. End of story. Do you feel better now?
Yeah.
There's hope for humanity after all.
That was wonderful. That was the perfect 1-2.
Yeah, and it was short, which was good after the long.
It was wonderful.
Yeah, good. Any other comments or questions? Okay, thank you, whoever is here.
Thank you.
For
Yeah.
being with us and sticking it out to the end.
Oh, it was wonderful. Thank you so much, Marjorie. A pleasure.
Good.
We
Good.
should go on and give a little